The 90s is often remembered as a decade of peace, success, and prosperity. About 61 million people around the world were using pagers to communicate with one another. The rise of cable television and the internet made the world a smaller place than it ever had been before. Bill Gates was worth about 89 billion by the end of the decade. These are just a few interesting facts I found about the 90s. I can't really tell you much about the 90s because I did not grow up on that era, but what I can tell you is the horror movies and content I have consumed from that decade, and most importantly, how the Scream franchise saved the horror genre from dying. Horror in the 90s was getting stale. In other words, there weren't many new horror movies breaking box office records like how they were in the 80s. Don't get me wrong, the 1990s had its highs in the box office, but most horror movies before Scream came out weren't doing so well. The horror franchises that were huge in the 80s weren't booming as much, and horror fans were hungry for something new. It's safe to say that horror movies in the 80s were dominated by slasher films. We got new horror icons that were introduced in this era. I like to call these horror icons the Big Four. To this day, we still come back and talk about these icons being important figures when it comes to the genre. The four names I am speaking of is Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Chucky, and Michael Myers. Yes, I know Michael Myers' first movie came out in 1978 and he wasn't actually introduced in the 80s, but most horror characters that came out after Halloween 1978 were somewhat inspired by the character of Michael Myers. That is why I consider him as one of the Big Four in horror. An article on Screen Rant stated that it's no secret that Friday the 13th took inspiration from early slasher horror movies like Halloween, but it copied most of its elements from one 1970s Italian horror movie. Friday the 13th screenwriter Victor Miller has plainly said that he saw Halloween and wanted to make a similar movie in a new location while also being inspired by teen comedies that were popular at the time. Most of the movies from these franchises were making big bucks in the 80s. If a movie was doing huge numbers, there was a good chance that Hollywood was creating multiple movies for that franchise. And that is what actually happened for the Big Four in this time period. We got to see multiple sequels and trilogies that people were very much enjoying in this time period. But once the 90s hit, people started to get tired of these movies. There was nothing new and mysterious about the Big Four in the 90s. They were using the same formula in their movies for quite some time, and people were starting to notice as well. They already knew how a horror movie was going to end, and they were already aware of the horror cliches. The final girl in the movie was close to dying, and the killer was out to get her. Somehow, the final girl defeated the bad guy in the movie, and it seemed like the bad guy was actually dead. Before the credits actually rolled, there was a slight hint that the killer was still alive, and that there was going to be another movie in the franchise. It sounds like I'm actually hating these films, but I am actually not. I actually do enjoy these movies. My favorite Friday the 13th movie is Part 6, Jason Lives, and my favorite A Nightmare on Elm Street movie is the third one in the franchise. The only franchise from the Big Four where I actually feel like they try to differentiate from their previous movies and not repeat themselves over and over again were the Child's Play movies. It seemed impossible and there was actually no way that Chucky was going to come back. But I like that the writers came up with something awesome for these movies and that they connected them so well. The biggest movie that came out from the 90s was the film called The Silence of the Lambs. This movie made $130 million at the domestic box office. I personally haven't seen the full movie, but I have seen a few clips here and there, and I know what the movie is about. An FBI agent is seeking help from a psychopathic killer named Dr. Hannibal Lecter so they can catch another serial killer. Dr. Hannibal Lecter is intelligent, but he is also deadly at the same time. Movies back then usually focus on one villain, but for Silence of the Lambs, there was actually more than one, and it was interesting to see a cannibal monster helping the police find another monster. This dynamic, one killer providing insight into another with someone else in between, is reflective of society's fascination with documentaries and shows where the average person learns about these infamous killers. Coming back to the big four of horror, Child's Play 2 was released in the first year of the decade and made $28 million. When Child's Play 3 hit theaters a year later, this one made $14 million. Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare made $34 million. Since the movie was actually called The Final Nightmare, people actually thought that this was going to be the last movie of the franchise. But 3 years later, Hollywood came out with New Nightmare, and that movie turned out to be the lowest grossing movie in the franchise. It made $18 million. Sure, it cost $8 million to make the movie, but that was very low since this was already an established franchise. Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers didn't do so great either, coming in at $15 million. It was the third lowest film in the franchise for Halloween. Same thing happened to Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday, making $15 million at the box office. The ones horror characters who dominated the box office throughout the 80s were becoming a thing of the past. Hollywood was losing its biggest horror characters, and it was time for a change. Enter Scream 1996. Legendary film director Wes Craven, like many horror fans, was not in favor of how the previous decade had turned what was once scary into pop icons, and wanted to bring Freddy Krueger back to being a myth, someone who was feared by many instead of someone who was liked. New Nightmare was a proper barrier for the movie franchise for the rest of the decade until Freddy vs. Jason came along years later. Wes Craven was looking forward to a new project, a similar project to how he did with New Nightmare, by bringing horror into the real world. In other words, making a horror movie within a horror movie. Scream was the movie to bring back horror from the grave. Remember what I told you that people were more self-aware about how a horror movie was going to end? Well, Wes Craven knew all the horror cliches as well, and so he made Scream as satire as possible. Not as a parody movie. The one character who I believe is the closest to the audience was Randy Meeks, played by none other than Jamie Kennedy. He was someone who knew the ins and outs of what a horror movie is, and he draws references from other well-known horror movies throughout the film. When Randy got killed on Scream 2, 1997, there was no one else to lean into because he was the one that was guiding the audience throughout the movie. One reason I believe Scream brought the horror genre back on the map was because we actually didn't know who the killer in the movie was. Who is Ghostface? Who in the world was this person?
Who is this fucking guy? He's got no credits! Ah!
Why was he going around town murdering all these people? Well, if you've seen the movies, you know, but when you first saw these movies, you didn't know who the killer was. And horror fans were intrigued to find out who did it and why. It's like watching a Scooby-Doo episode. Throughout the episode, you want to find out who is terrifying all these people around town, and by the ending of the episode, the monster is finally revealed and you get to find out who did it and why they did it. The last reason I believe this movie intrigued older horror fans and even the new generation of horror fans was because of how they reveal the killer and his motives. In other horror films like Halloween and Friday the 13th, we get to find out the horror villains' motives on why they kill, but never get to really see their actual faces to an extent. Since Billy Loomis was the one who planned most of the killings in Scream, He is probably the first in the genre to reveal himself as the killer and the one to give ulterior motives the clearest. Stu was the sidekick in the movie that was helping Billy, and his reason was because of peer pressure, he said. But Billy Loomis' motive was more profound and deeper than his. Billy Loomis is a horror fanatic like Randy Meeks, but in the most evil way possible. His references he gives out throughout the film are creepier and are disturbing to some extent. With what he learns from horror movies, he uses that to go on a killing spree as of an act of revenge against Sydney's mom. Billy's anger stems from his mother's abandonment following his father's affair with Maureen, who was Sydney's mother. Sydney and Billy were together throughout the movie, but by the ending of the movie, they weren't together anymore. They both got into a fight, and it seemed like Billy was dead, but then Randy told Sydney that he was gonna come back just one more time, and he did. Sydney shot him in the head, and that was the end for Billy Loomis. There was no way that he was ever gonna come back from that. And for Stu, Sydney killed him by dropping a TV on his head. He wasn't gonna come back either, since he did get electrocuted by the TV. Once the credits rolled, moviegoers were so impressed with this movie that the years that followed, horror started to come back better than ever before. Scream 1996 made $173 million at the box office worldwide and $103 million in the US. A new generation of horror fans were starting to be more invested in horror films. Even the older generation, who grew up watching horror films like Halloween, gave Halloween H2O a try. This one made $55 million at the box office. It was one of the most successful films from the franchise. Not just Halloween H2O 20 years later made a huge profit, but also newer movies were given a chance by the audience. Like I Know What You Did Last Summer, it made $72 million. Anaconda, starring Jennifer Lopez and Ice Cube, made $65 million. As for the big four that I mentioned, well, there was just only one movie left for this decade to come out, and that was Bride of Chucky. This one made $32 million, way higher than what Child's Play 2 and 3 made in the years they came out on. It was time for a change, and Scream was the movie that did it for moviegoers and for horror fans across the world. With its references to the genre's classics and being more aware of horror movies, this movie became a huge hit worldwide. The Scream franchise is not my favorite horror franchise by any means, but I do give props for it for saving horror from a time where horror movies were about to go extinct. This is how Scream brought horror back from the grave. With Scream 6 coming out this year, we will get to see more of these new characters that were introduced in the previous film, and a new killer dressed up as Ghostface. We will get to see what they have in store for us. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it all the way through, please leave your opinion on what you think about the Scream franchise. Also like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers here on the channel. I would like to make it to 10,000 by the end of the year. Make sure to turn on those post notifications as well, because sometimes YouTube doesn't really send the notifications out. So make sure to turn on that bell as well. If you like this video and want more, reminder, I have multiple videos like these that I have made over the years. So if you're interested, I have an in-depth horror playlist of your favorite horror movies. I have made a corpse bride video on what if Victor was actually married to Emily, videos about horror characters' motives, on why they kill, and much more. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through, guys. I do appreciate you. And that is it, guys. Thank you so much for watching again. As always, take care and live to the fullest.